conducting some empirical phenomenological psychological research on daydreaming. Daydreaming is non-meditation, but it is a cognate phenomenon. And we'll be talking about that element too, and how it might relate to the phenomenology of meditation and perhaps even the pedagogy of meditation. But before I go into my research on daydreaming, I'd like to do a bit of a preamble for about 10 minutes where I just share with you my thoughts about the convergence and divergence between phenomenology and mindfulness, if you don't mind, and sort of putting together some loose ends about the relationship. First of all, I want to say that, I think at the conference we've been talking about, we're using the word mindfulness very loosely, right? And we don't really mean vipassana necessarily. We don't mean sati necessarily. We don't necessarily mean the John Kabat-Zinn brand of mindfulness. We're sort of speaking about it generally. And I've been found it very illuminating to see everyone going right to Heidegger's understanding of mindfulness. That's been very enriching for me. So when I use the word mindfulness, I'm using its very generic sense. We've been using it here, okay? So I'm going to read a little bit. It's not my style to read, but I'm going to read a little bit, just make sure I'm clear. And then I'll go into the PowerPoint slide. So convergences and divergences. Despite their methodological similarities, particularly the epoche and the Samkhya yogic Buddhist technique of Nirodha, which has been discussed by many people, phenomenology and mindfulness, and again, apart from their cultural and historical circumstances, are distinguished by what are supposedly different ends and purposes. Phenomenology has evidently been a scientific or philosophically based knowledge-oriented enterprise within the Western Academy. And mindfulness supposedly began more like a medical diagnosis and prescription for the alleviation of the psychic suffering at the heart of the human condition. If only it were so simple. It ain't. Certainly, Husserl's appeals to us in the crisis went beyond mere academic epistemology when he cried out against, quote, the conflagration of disbelief that threatens the heart, the soul of European humanity. Or when Merleau-Ponty warns of scientism as a, quote, nightmare from whence we may never wake, we see the summoning of a moral and spiritual mission that is more than a detached scientific attitude. So while it is true that phenomenology is almost definitively the application of a certain reflective attitude towards our understanding of the world and its givenness, starting with Husserl, there has also been a social change dimension to phenomenology. We don't just study the natural attitude. There's also an element of wanting to change the natural attitude in phenomenology. And progress in professional and applied non-philosophical fields, such as nursing, social work, psychology, and psychiatry, abound. And its impact on social theory, as in Frantz Fanon, Herbert Marcuse, Foucault, de Beauvoir, and the Frankfurt School, is just unquestionable. So, the engaged project of alleviating suffering is not something entirely detachable from phenomenology. So we're mixing things up a bit here. Here goes another dimension to this. A unique scientific enterprise was also evident across ancient and medieval South Asian culture. Many contemplative techniques and practices were applied, not just to alleviate suffering, but to also understand nature and the world, an epistemic project, in the matter of a pure science. The work of David Gordon White, it's remarkable research, and I really want to draw your attention to his work on, he really started the whole field of what's called tantric studies. Gordon White reveals how there has always been a steady stream of tantric alchemists across medieval South Asia who sought to explore nature, extend life, gain health, and sometimes even achieve control over other people through what one could call a yogic science. Yogic science is real. It really was there. It was not unlike Europe's own alchemical tradition, motivated by many interests beyond the alleviation of suffering. In this combined meditative practices with rituals and the use of plant medicines and psychical yogic austerities and practices to achieve instrumental power and knowledge. not just to alleviate suffering. And let's just think of the samurai, okay, their use of mental yogic tech, or you could call meditative techniques in their martial arts. What are the martial arts? But a very practical application of meditation. And in the epic Indian literature, you always see of gods, goddesses, and heroes retreating up into the mountains to build their yogic powers and energies to go out and vanquish their enemy. So meditation was a kind of a technology, as it was seen by these people, as more than just alleviating suffering. We need to make this point. Furthermore, ancient Indian universities, informed by yogic Buddhist contemplative practices, were practicing philosophy in the pure research sense of science. And across all the ancient medieval periods, there was a Buddhist trove of literature that is massive. It is the largest trove of philosophical literature known to humanity, and most of it has not been translated out of Pali, and it's still sitting there, waiting to be translated. So when we talk about Buddhism, we don't really fully understand what we're talking about. It's so massive. So the dichotomy between pure science or philosophy and practical techniques for alleviation of suffering is not a tidy demarcation. And it just needs to be said that meditation has been used as something like a scientific instrument. But having said this, we still have to marvel at the stunning commonality between 20th century phenomenology and mindfulness and yoga. It is pretty remarkable. We have to marvel at this. We have here two traditions that occurred independently across time and culture. However, one is rooted in the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, and the other in Asian yogic thought. One is European and Western, and one is Asian and Eastern. Well, guess what? It ain't that simple either. Okay, that's a problematic dichotomy. This demarcation is really not so clear. Let me spell this out. There was much cultural diffusion between India and the classical Mediterranean world than most scholarship has previously acknowledged. We've been carrying the dominator Orientalist narrative of Western civilization. All this, it's not that simple. Scholarship has been unearthing the historical facts here, and the Persian Empire was, almost think of it as a electromagnetic conduit between the Greek-speaking and the Sanskrit-speaking world. There was huge intercourse going on across the Persian Empire between the Greek-speaking peoples and Sanskrit-speaking peoples. And it's a remarkable relationship. The American art historian, Thomas McEvely, has sifted through physical archaeological evidence. We're not talking hippie, okay? We're not talking New Age. We're talking physical archaeological evidence, and he lays it all out, you know, and it's quite a strong case. He points out how ancient Indian thought, Vedantism and Buddhism, were post-Alexander very likely influenced by the idealism of Plato and Aristotle. And you can see it when you read Vedanta. You're feeling the connections with Aristotle. It's acknowledged that there was a vigorous trade in luxury goods between India and the post-Alexandrian Hellenic kingdoms and the later Roman Empire. In fact, there were fusion, this is really important, people don't know this, there were fusion Greco-Buddhist kingdoms in what was then called Bactria, which is now called Afghanistan. Okay, and you can see these Greek Buddhists, you know, it's just beautiful. You know, it's very clear that there was a fusion culture there. And these fusion kingdoms that went on for about 400 years, okay, before they got sort of diffused, they had a huge impact on Indian culture and Indian cultural history. Very, very big. And of course, on their spiritual practices and traditions. And India, being India, just absorbs everything, you know, and mixes it up, and it just becomes another caste. Okay. So it's acknowledged. So also, there's the Silk Road system, which is an incredible conduit between cultures. So it's not acknowledged enough that there was a lot going on, that there was diffusion. McEvely also demonstrates, on the other hand, that there was a diffusion between tantric Indian yoga and certain Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Orphic Dionysian Greek spiritualities. This is really important. Even culturally diffusing into medieval Christian mysticism, Jewish Kabbalism, and Islamic Sufism. And I'm sure Dermot's going to hit on some of this when he speaks about Meister Eckhart. He was influenced by the Orthodox Eastern school of Christianity, which was impacted by the Arabs, which is impacted by the Indians. So they were all, culture is the intermixture of culture. And we need to acknowledge this more. This neat, tidy thing about East and West just doesn't really work fully. Yes, it did happen for the last 400 years under the colonialist period. That was a narrative that became a self-sustaining narrative, but it's falling apart now. We're kind of going back into the default mode, and we're understanding that there's diffusion. Now, the wind blew both ways, and McEvely's work has profound implications for cross-culture. It appears the wind blew west from India to Greece pre-Alexander, or pre-Aristotle, I should say. But then after the Alexandrian, I don't know what to call Alexander, whether it was his Stalingrad or his conquest, who knows. After Alexander, it seems the wind went west to east. And so it went both ways, but there seems to be a shift in tide with Alexander. So while it's true that until the British occupation, these systems were severed, when we take the long historical view, there was always interchange. And Husserl's narrative of purely European culture is, open to critique here. So here we are. Certainly, Europe devalued its contemplative traditions as Newtonian Copernican metaphysics swept the continent, and we dropped Aristotle's formal and final causes in place of just energy and matter. In this universe, mind was banished into mere philosophizing, and it made irrelevant to the enterprise of science. In fact, it was considered an extraneous confounding variable to the scientific mindset. And where it was addressed, where mind was mentioned, it was psychologized into the subjective object, which is the excruciatingly contradictory emblem of contemporary psychology. So before the contemporary mindfulness movement, we did have Thomas Merton, who did try to reinvigorate the Christian monastic tradition and to bring the Christian contemplative practice into being. He really did start this ball rolling in the 60s. And we have to give him credit for this. We also had in Germany Rudolf Steiner. He deserves credit. Steiner was originally informed by the Aurobindo and the Theosophist movement, but he rebelled against them and turned towards the Western mystical traditions, which is what I think is Steiner's unique contribution. He's much maligned, and it's very unfortunate, but he really does deserve attention. There's great scholarly work in Steiner. But so there's been an attempt to recover our traditions, and the vision here is that like a dying branch of a plant that is dying, we can bring that plant back to life by grafting onto it a living branch. And that's what I see kind of going on right now. We're looking to the east, we're looking to the Asian living traditions to see if we can resuscitate a desiccated contemplative tradition here in the West. And I think phenomenology is the bridge. I think this is the place, this is where it can happen. We're the link language that can really help this project. And I also want to say that this is the mission of what we could call contemplative phenomenology, almost like a new field. And again, I have to admire the work of Michel Pitbull and Natalie Dupré and Claire Petit-Mignon, who have really worked hard to make this into actually a field with a unique approach, a unique method that is appropriate for the subject matter. And I will share with you that they've had remarkable conferences sponsored by Mind and Life Europe, not Mind and Life America, Mind and Life Europe, where they have had conferences where for 5 days, philosophers and psychologists would get together, meditate for 3 hours in the morning, just simple meditation, no particular dogma to it, have lunch, and then have academic workshops for the rest of the afternoon, and then drink wine at dinner at night. And it was a remarkable model for having a conference, remarkable model, because it was done the French way with the wine at night. But is because when you meditate in the morning, there's no longer the academic ego bustling that you have at so many conferences. We're all in it together. After you're meditating together for a whole morning, it's a very different atmosphere. It's a unique sense sort of thing. You're participating in the activity that you're talking about. So it's a very, if they do it again, I really recommend that everyone participate in this. It's a wonderful event, and everybody who goes to these things are really remarkably transformed by it. It's a great way to teach phenomenology. Now, of course, furthermore, the current dangers in what's called contemplative studies, which is another thing going on, is that in contemplative studies, there's a tendency to scientize meditation. And we all enjoy learning about the meditating brain. We all love brain stuff. It's great to find out what the brain does. But of course, and there's a lot of utility to these facts, but we always need to remember the brain is not the things themselves. It's been said many times, so we don't need to beat that up. Okay. Finally, let's always respect and honor the contemplative traditions of our ancestors, Asian, indigenous, and indigenous too. We're not talking enough about indigenous contemplative practices, which is very important and missing here at our conference so far, and European practices. We also need to respect the modern experimental research. There's a lot to, it grounds things in certain ways, but let's not be mentally hijacked or possessed by any of these forces. Let's maintain our independence here and keep our phenomenological perspective clear. This I would call another mission of contemplative phenomenology, to forward a science that's coherent with its subject matter. Again, a unity of approach, method, and content. Okay, now to my presentation. I'm going to start with my conclusion, so you know that I'm going somewhere. My conclusion will be that ordinary daydream consciousness, when elucidated phenomenologically, can reveal something like a mindful lucidity, not exactly, but cognate, that is inherent to all of us. This is never to say that we always behave and function in a lucidly mindful way. I'm not saying that, but I want to affirm that just like empathy, mindful lucidity is inherent to all of us. I repeat, just like empathy, we don't have to think about empathy. We are empathic, as Husserl teaches us. Similarly, I think we're all already lucid, but the natural attitude educates it out of our system. We lose our lucidity. And I think Plato's onto something when he talks about how we're born into the world lucid. We lose it as we come into things. One could call this a dysfunctionally linear, hyper-rationalized dominator culture. But I want to say something about that. This is not exclusive to Europe. Dominator cultures happen all over the place. It's not just a European thing. I don't think we have to be clear about that. So by mindfulness, I think I'm meaning lucidity and being awake, present, responsible. There is the obvious association with light, and people can critique that, but it's a damn good metaphor. Light, luminosity. The Latin root lucidas is about shining, clarity, transparency, very much close to the yogic notion of sattva, which is clarity. Lightness, not just light. I just can't think of many better metaphors than light. And light doesn't mean you're negating darkness. Light foregrounds darkness. It makes darkness possible. But again, like all metaphors, it's very problematic. But what I'd like to think of is like, by contemplative lucidity, I think of, you've all heard of lucid dreams. Many people probably had lucid dreams. You wake up, you're aware you're dreaming. Anybody? Any takers? Yeah, it's an amazing thing. I hope you all fly when you do that. The first thing you gotta do is lift your arms and fly, okay? And you can fly. You know, you can defy all the laws of the physical world. And there's a funny thing when you're lucidly dreaming, you're aware that you're dreaming and you're awake and you know it. But if you think too much about it, pop, you wake up. It's a tricky thing. Well, this is going to become an issue with daydreaming. So get ready, put your seatbelts on. And what I want to suggest is, I think that the purpose of meditation, or whatever we want to call it, is to become lucidly awake. This is how I read Merleau-Ponty, in the visible and the invisible. I think he's asking us to be lucidly awake, to be aware of our consciousness constituting the world and it constituting me back in a fully woken way. I use the word woke, but I like woke. So what I'm talking about is a global affective cognizance. And this is where I really am going to use Merleau-Ponty to help illuminate this, especially, so I'll make some references to a remarkable chapter in the Phenomenology of Perception on the cogito, where he revises the Descartes' understanding of the cogito. So daydreaming is oh, by the way, I don't mean zoning out or tuning out or dissociation. I don't mean that at all. I mean something else. And I don't mean focusing on a task. We all know this. So daydreaming is a downtrodden phenomenon. It gets kicked around. It's on the bottom of the totem pole. We were all taught not to daydream. Our teachers yelled at us, and we got complaints in our report cards for being daydreamers. And I know I did. And it's something that we teach kids not to do. But of course, we don't teach kids how to pay attention. We just tell them not to daydream. And if you were like me, I think some of your happiest moments in childhood were probably spent daydreaming, and probably still today. So there's a lot to say here, and Freud's got some insights I'll share very quickly with you. So for my phenomenological studies on daydreaming, I've consistently found an element of this kind of mindful-like lucidity that is silently at the heart of ordinary mundane daydreaming. Silently at the heart. I don't want to overstate my claims. I want to be careful here. It's not more that when we uncover the daydreaming experience, we find a lucidity behind it that is cause for reflection in relation to the meditation process. A treasure to be mined, not found yet, but to be mined rather than direct to be cast off. So there's something important here. So I'm going to switch to the slide here. And before I jump into daydreaming, I want to cover a couple more meditation issues, and then we'll get going. Oh, help. It's not behaving. It was. Maybe I could click it. All right, good enough. All right, some quick things. What do we mean by meditating? And there's ways of meditating. And so generally, from what I've been reading about meditating, it's been a long time I've been reading this stuff. And there's kind of two ways of understanding types of meditating. One is the single-pointed focus style of meditating, and the other one is the open observation or letting. Okay, so for Meister, Eckhart, and Heidegger speak of Gelassenheit. It's obviously a letting form of meditation. As John Lennon says, important, relax your mind and let it flow downstream. Let it happen. So single-pointed, there's these two types of meditation. Now, they're both not good or bad, but the first one, single-pointed focus, usually done for beginners because it's kind of clear how to do this. You focus on one thing. And breath is usually the vehicle for gaining access to the present moment. So it's usually focusing on breath. But if that's all you do is focus on your breath, what are you doing? It's just, I've heard some people say, well, if you just focus on one thing, that makes you stupid. There's more to it than that, than just focusing on one. What you're doing is you're developing attentional muscles, so to speak. Again, being metaphorical, you're learning to focus. And that's why you focus on the breath. And you don't stay there with just one thing. What you do is you learn to ground your focus. And then there's the second one, which is the open observation or letting. Well, the problem with that one is that if you let yourself go, you're going to fall asleep, right? And we've all done that, right? We meditate. And, the monks have to run around and whack people when they fall asleep. So you can't just let go. You can't just let it all hang out, baby. You can't just do that. There's something more to it. So of course, the wisdom here is that you need to do both somehow. You don't just do single pointed focus, but you gain the ability to stay grounded and stay positioned. And then you open up and let your mind go, but you stay present as the mind moves. You stay focused and centered as the mind moves. You learn to pilot the experience of the whirlpools of the mind. You learn to pilot yourself through it. And that is where the luminosity begins to happen. That's where amazing things. Now, for beginning meditators, it's actually usually very negative because it's usually anger and fear that comes up. It's usually repressed traumatic things. This is why people don't meditate. They hate it. Students hate meditating. They can't stand it when asked them to meditate. And I have to really train them that when the negative things happen, let it happen, be with it, watch it, take an interest, be interested in meditation. Say, very interesting as you watch these weird things happening. And that's the position you take, this kind of open monitoring that is both focused and grounded, but also letting. So you don't fall asleep and you don't get compulsively hung up on one thing. So that's how I understand it. The trick is to do both, to be present to the dehiscence of consciousness in its arising, to be present to the dehiscence of consciousness in its arising. That's what I'm meaning by lucidity. So, okay. So most beginner meditating is really trying to meditate. And, there's a lot of pretense in the meditation world. There's a lot of pietism. But if you're really honest, most of us are, we don't know what we're doing when we're sitting there. And it's trying to meditate. And I always teach students, if you're trying to meditate, you're meditating. It's the effort to meditate that takes you, and no one gets there. There's no place where you get enlightened. It's the effort to meditate that makes it happen. And also, let's be honest, most of the time we're meditating, we're daydreaming. It's just fantasies, spinning off into fantasies. And so many of the mindfulness techniques, meditations, are about how to deal with your daydreams. But usually it's about turning your attention away from the daydreams and to focus on your breath again. And I'm saying, well, maybe not. Maybe there's something the daydreams can tell us. Maybe there's something to the daydreams. We can stay with them. And maybe that's in itself a kind of practice. But again, just quickly before I jump into it, Patanjali and Husserl are amazingly close to each other. We all know what the epoche is, and Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, and this influenced the whole Buddhist tradition as well. He uses the idea of mind as chitta-vritti nirodha, which is the suspension of the whirlpool of the mind, such that the true seer may come forth and see the world as it actually is. That's pretty damn close to what we do as phenomenologists. Pretty interesting. And so I just want to throw that out there before we go any further. So in summary, both traditions, both the meditative traditions of Asia and phenomenology, they reveal intentionality. They're techniques for becoming aware of intentionality. They name the mundane ego, okay, the ordinary natural attitude ego or self, the ordinary self. And they emphasize the primacy of direct, raw, pre-reflective lived experience, temporality, lived body relationships, and so on. There's a lot of comments. That's just the beginning. It could go on forever. So now let's go to daydreaming. So Freud, Freud, God bless him, his masterpiece was the interpretation of dreams. It is a masterpiece of European literature. In dreaming, he speaks of a dream censor. So and it doesn't mean another person, but it's as if there's another mind that is creating the dream to distract the person to stay asleep. The other mind taking the emotions and embellishing it into a story to keep the person sleeping. And the censor doesn't let things go too far. It's an interesting concept. It comes up again in 1908 when he writes two wonderful articles about daydreaming. And this is where Freud was at his most creative. When he's talking about it, he wrote about daydreaming and the creative artist. And he gave this as a lecture at a bookshop in front of an art house audience. And this is where, before he had a split with Jung. And after Jung, he contracts and gets kind of very conservative and orthodox. But this is where he's most good. And he says that daydreaming, he spoke of it as having a spectator perspective. I watch myself, I'm awake. When I'm daydreaming, I'm dreaming, but I'm awake. And he was fascinated by this. And he says that the creative writer does the same thing. It's very syncretic with what we just, the two previous talks. So like the censor, there's a spectator that watches this and that we're engaged with the creative activity. And the creative writer simply takes their daydreams and makes them palpable to everybody else. That's the difference between them and us. He also says that daydreaming is what we do as adults in place of childhood play. Children could play out their affectivity. We can't play out our affectivity. We'll get kicked out of school. So we have to daydream. And, we sit still and we simply go into our imaginary reveries. And when we daydream, daydreams are always, and I'll get into the method in a minute, daydreams are always the manifestation of an emotion that needs expression that can't be expressed. Almost every daydream does this. And also, it's really, there's a lot of modern science on, they call it, what they call it, passive consciousness, but there's a lot of studies going on now. They've discovered that the default mode of the brain, when the brain is not focused on a task, guess what the default mode is of the brainwave patterns? It's daydreaming. And this also corresponds to a lot of questionnaire research that shows that 60% of waking life is spent daydreaming, or something like daydreaming, close to daydream consciousness. Now, there's a wonderful phenomenological tradition on imagination, and phenomenology is, of course, the approach to imagination par excellence. Husserl didn't just emphasize the importance of imagination, he also made imagination into a method. So it's both a method and also a worthy subject matter. What is time consciousness but an embellishment to the idea of imagination? No time for that. Schutz, Alfred Schutz, again, he needs to be read more. People don't pay attention to Schutz. He's so important, especially for working in applied phenomenology outside of in other disciplines. But Schutz speaks of worlds, finite provinces of reason, miniature worlds that we inhabit. There's the world of working reality. There's the world of religious reality. There's the world of daydreaming, and there's the world of night dreaming. And these are all self-contained finite provinces of meaning. And daydreaming, of course, go into the world of fantasy here. Sartre, of course, we famously speaks of imagination as a form of self-deception. He's a bit negative, but there's more to Sartre than that. And of course, my knight in shining armor is Merleau-Ponty, who speaks of imagination. He regretted calling it the phenomenology of perception. If he would have called it something else, but he called it perception. He didn't mean empiricist perception. He meant the phenomenology of the imaginary perceptual. And the imaginary is always linked like a twin to his idea of perception. It's always latently there. And he speaks of the imaginary texture of the real. You see these metaphors all over the place, interlacing and interlocking between the imaginary and the real. And of course, we've got a wonderful, thriving the current generation of literature of, Ed Case, Richard Carney, Salas Ganusis, and Julia Jansen are working on imaginations. Great stuff going on. So I just need to say that. Okay. So I've been consulting these works while I'm also doing this empirical stuff. So this is what we call empirical. But by empirical phenomenological research, we don't mean empiricist. We mean that we're looking at direct experiences. We mean real empiricism. So this is not a methodology conference, so I'm not going to go into the weeds here. But I think you deserve to know a little bit about how I gathered my information. So the method I use is it's the oldest, most established qualitative method around. It was started by Amadeo Giorgi in the 60s. And, there's a plethora. Everybody has a new acronym for their qualitative method now. And they're all new. And I just haven't seen anything better than what Giorgi came up with. It's pretty good stuff. It's a whole analysis technique. It's pretty simple, and it works. So data gathering is for this project, and again, our overall approach. And the names have been many. We call it the descriptive phenomenological, existential phenomenological method. Scott Churchill. And Fred Wirtz just calls it the phenomenological psychological method. We've never, everybody uses a different name for it. So we haven't been good at marketing. Okay, we haven't been, we need a marketing consultant, so we can compete with all the other acronyms out there. But there it is, and it's pretty steady. So anyway, our approach to data gathering, there's a lot of literature right now about phenomenological interviews, and it gets a bit fetishistic. There's no one way to do a phenomenological interview because every phenomenon is different. And our take is that your data gathering method has to match the phenomenon. Let the phenomenon speak in itself, of itself, in itself, of itself, in itself, whatever Heidegger said. Let it speak. And the idea of gathering data is to get out of the way so you get rich description. So this stuff about, all these things about how you're supposed to do an interview, I think it's problematic. I found an interview technique that works really cool for daydreaming. I found that if I get people to write down I'll say to someone, write down a daydream. Please describe a daydream. Tell me what happened before, during, and after the daydream. Talk to me as if you're speaking to someone who's never had a daydream. And people give me a one-page thing, and people find it fun. And so then we take the written description and we sit down together and I conduct a follow-up interview based on what they wrote. So that what they wrote structures. I don't structure them. They structure the interview by what they wrote. Now, of course, I have an agenda of questions. There's certain existentials. I want to hear about time, space, relations to others, their embodiment, their sense of reality. But I try not to push those agendas. I try to sneak them in when the time is right. So they lead, and I don't ask why. I never ask why questions. I never ask, in fact, I avoid questions. I mostly try to just repeat back keywords. Keywords I kind of repeat back in it, like Carl Rogers, just repeat it back. And that tends to really encourage good description. So so we work with there's data analysis, and the data analysis method is simply you transcribe the interview and the protocol, and you read it for the whole, and then you break it into, you chunk it up into bits, because you can't, the whole thing is hard to manage, and and then you look at each of the parts with like a microscope, but you do it within the phenomenological attitude, and that phenomenological attitude is not the epoche of transcendental phenomenological philosophy. It's the epoche of psychological phenomenology. It's a psychological epoche, and the psychological epoche is about going in and out of the natural attitude. Our subject is, our participant is in the natural attitude, describing their daydream within the natural attitude, and I want to hear how they see it, and I have to enter into their natural attitude to understand it, but I also need to step out of it in order to see it more lucidly from a phenomenological perspective. So weaving in and out. And Schutz is very clear about this. Schutz is very clear about how the psychological phenomenological reduction, or epoche, he calls it. And Merleau-Ponty practices this, is very clear in his understanding of what he calls reduction, is very much about going in and out. And that's what we practice. It's not that we deny the transcendental nature of consciousness. We just don't we're not there while we're doing research. That's all. So we may refer to transcendental concepts in consciousness later, but not while we're doing the research. As simple as that. So there's no antinomy between the two. It's just we're doing one for a particular project at a certain time. So there it is. That's the technique in a nutshell. And the goal is to develop general structures. What's the generalized structure of this experience? We'll look at the particular person's experience, like a case study, which is what's essential to this experience. And then we're going to look at what's essential. After doing a bunch of these, we use eidetic variation to come up with what's essential, psychologically essential to the experience of daydreaming for most people in our culture at this time in history. So we don't make universal claims, we make general claims. So that's the method. I'll stop at that. So here's the general structure of daydream, and I want to spell it out to you and see what you guys think. Daydream begins as an affect, an emotion that cannot be fully expressed in the context of the moment. I'm driving the car. I'm really pissed off at something Trump said or did, and it's on my mind. It's bugging me. I'm driving the car. There's nothing to do. I'm bored. And I go into a fantasy where I'm telling him off, or giving a speech or something, or doing something heroic, and I'm enjoying myself in my heroic daydream. And suddenly I'm at work, and I had gone through 7 traffic lights. I passed several trucks, and I'm at work, and I don't know how that happened. Right, everybody? You've all been there? Am I explaining anything very exotic here? It's very mundane. So what I'm doing is I can't express my anger. So I go into a daydream, and I passively slip into an alternative subject world scenario. Now, I can give you all kinds of quotes. I could go on for hours with quotes from subject. I don't want to bore you with that. I'm giving you my cooked data, not raw data. And this is what people say. It's pretty robust when I do these interviews. They pretty much tell me they always use passive language, how they slip into another world, as they call it. And there is both, and it's another world. And I'm operating in this other world. And it's always a scenario. It's a drama. It's like a movie scene. Okay. And they use movie language. They use language from the expressive arts to convey what the experience is. Now, the scenario is affectively charged and given the accent of reality, as Schutz puts it. In other words, it's believed, but it's believed in a funny way. If you ask people what's real, where are you during the daydream, they all say, I'm in the daydream because that's where I feel I am. That's where my emotion is. That's what's really going on for me. And my body is in automatic pilot. And then, of course, the daydream will either fulfill itself emotionally, or they have to snap out of it because there's a car coming at them, okay, or the teacher's looking at them. and so on. They're obviously spacing out and embarrassing themselves. So it's believed as felt. And so now I'm going to talk about the syncretic and diachronic moment of the daydream. So we're going to take a photograph of the daydream, and then we're going to look at it as a kind of moving movie. Okay, and it's what follows. So the synchronic structure, the photograph, the moment of the daydream, if you can do that, you just bear with me here, is that there's the habitual subject, there's Jim in the car, driving the car habitually, and in the habitual world of the same route I take on my commute every day, right? And my habitual subject is in relation to my habitual world, but I leave that affectively and inhabit a daydreaming world. And in that daydreaming world, I'm also there as a daydreaming subject. Okay, I am myself in that world and acting in that world. Now, this is where it gets very tricky. People describe, and it's you have to be careful not to lead them, but I find over and over again, people say, well, they get stumped and they get mixed up. And the two of you go into trance together. These interviews, as you go very intimate, the two of you go into the daydream together expressively. And they say, you know, I'm in charge. I'm like God. I can do what I want. And it's, you know, and yet I'm in the daydream. And yet I also know I'm driving the car. In other words, they'll say, I know I'm driving the car and I know I'm in the daydream, but I don't want the two to mix. I want to keep them apart so I can continue daydreaming. So I know I'm daydreaming, but I know I need to drive the car, but I need to not mix the two together or the bubble will get popped. So people are actually very good at this. They're skilled at it. You know, and there are people that are skilled daydreamers. They just do this. So they describe this third standpoint. There's the habitual subject, driving the car, automatic pilot. There's the person in the daydream on the beach in Tahiti, wherever it is. And then there's this other standpoint, this nodal point that is a global awareness. So again, I'll tell you what I think about this. I'm going to use Aaron Gervich's field of consciousness to describe this. So here's the diachronic sense of how it goes. You've got, you know, here I am driving the car, not daydreaming. Then I'm daydreaming, and I'm in this kind of multiple ego-logical position while daydreaming. And then, boom, I snap out of it. I'm back in the habitual subject, habitual world relationship. So what's going on with the directing spirit? And I had to give it a name. It's kind of sloppy, directed spectator. I don't know what else to call it, you know, because you call it directing spectator because it captures the active and passive nature of this nodal point, this point. What you got going on here? People use this language all the time spontaneously. I don't push them. They use it. They say, you know, I'm like the actor in the movie, but I'm also the director, and I'm also writing it, and I'm directing it, and it's also like I'm criticizing at the same time. They talk about these multiple standpoints, okay? And they get very creative as they begin to talk about this. And so you've got this amazing sort of spectrum of perspectives that's going on in the moment of the daydream. So Gervich, so how do we understand this? Gervich, I turned to, is really interesting. Gervich, of course, taught Merleau-Ponty, and people don't know that about him. He taught Merleau-Ponty at Dermot, gave a great paper on this a couple years ago. He introduced Gestalt psychology to Merleau-Ponty. And one of Gervich's ideas in the field of consciousness, his real magnum opus, is that there's all consciousness involves a theme and a field and a margin. There's no way out of that. There's no way imaginable, he says, for there to be a consciousness that doesn't have this structure. So does Merleau-Ponty says the same thing. Everything's figure ground, Merleau-Ponty says. There's something going on with that. The theme is my explicit awareness. The field is the context of what I'm explicitly aware of. But the margin, and the margin is something really interesting. The margin is this kind of, it's not explicit. It's co-present. It's a silent background that makes both the field and theme happen. It's the invisible backdrop. It's Merleau-Ponty is invisible, you could say. And so the margin is there. And so as I've understood it, is that, you know, again, think of it this way, the margin's outside. You're not aware of the margin, but it's there. And if you are aware of it, it's really subtle. So we look at daydreaming as this dual intentionality, which comes right out of Husserl. And by the way, I discovered this before I read The Time Consciousness. And then when I read the time consciousness, I was like, wow, great, a match. You know, it was a kind of a discovery for me. And here's my point, is that marginal consciousness seems to be able to envelope both these subject-world relationships. There's a marginality that brings them together, that connects them in some way. And that's my way of representing this. And is this marginal consciousness something like meditative lucidity? Is this connected to it in some way? Now, it's not when we're daydreaming, but can we daydream in a way where we can access this marginal lucidity? This is a question I just want to throw at everyone. I'm not concluded on this. I come to you with this as more of a question than an assertion. What's really fun here is to compare this marginal consciousness, or this directing spectator, this lucid consciousness, is to compare it to the end of his treatment of Descartes' cogito in the cogito chapter of Phenomenology of Perception. He starts off with this sort of lumbering first half of the chapter, and then he concludes with this. And what Ramapo wants to do in this chapter is he wants to speak to the truth of the Cartesian cogito, but he wants to give it weight and substance. He wants to rehabilitate the cogito in another way. And I think that it gets even more illuminated when we think of this kind of tacit consciousness that is this directing spectator perspective. So unlike Freud's dream censor or even lucid dreaming, and not the same but cognate to meditative conditions of mind, reflections on daydream reveal an affectivity aware of itself. What is a daydream but an emotion that is imaged? It is an attempt to self-understand. Another thing about daydreaming is that every daydream interview I do, when you get into it, at the end of the day, no matter how mundane and silly the daydream may seem at first, at the end of the day, it's about their core existential projects. Their core existential project gets revealed in any discussion about any daydream. And it just happens without pushing. It just pops itself up. What they're about, what they're up to, the important things in their life, they all come up. So it's very interesting. So Merleau-Ponty, in contrast to the impersonal cogito of Descartes, the tacit cogito is, quote, myself experienced as myself, the presence of oneself to oneself, it's pure self-consciousness. It's weighted or thickened, and that's Merleau-Ponty. He wants to weight, he says the real cogito, not the Cartesian, but the true tacit cogito is thick, it's weight, and it's connected to the world through the existentials of time and space, embodiment, and personal relations. It's not this eternal cogito. So it knows itself, he says, only in those extreme situations in which it is under threat. For example, in the dread of death of another, or another's gaze upon me. Now, he's giving the negative here, but it also happens in situations of ecstasy and mystical reverie. And it happens in all kinds of points in our lives when we're suddenly aware of our life. And so when you get bad news, your whole life becomes present to you. And it gets aware, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, it gets moments when we realize we always knew everything all along. There's a tacit conscious that is globally aware of what's going on in our lives. And we can access it, but we don't. And it's an interesting question why we don't. He talks about the tacit cogito as one single experience inseparable from itself, one single living cohesion, one single temporality, which is engaged from birth in making itself progressively explicit and in confirming that cohesion in each successive moment. This is the tacit cogito. It's constantly trying to understand itself and express itself through its world, and it's always aware of itself from birth to possible death. This is a self-awareness which is called forth from trauma as much as ecstasy, and we could call this lucidity, or I like to call it visceral lucidity. It's visceral. So reflections. Again, I'm seeing this as a visceral thing, not something abstract or cognitive. As described by participants, their emotion has a reality positing dimension where participants are where they most feel they are as believed. And of course, we've got this parallels Husserl's orthodoxic positing, James's sense of reality, and Merleau-Ponty's perceptual faith. And of course, it has carnal textures. This is not imagination as something cognitive. This is carnal, it's felt. When people have daydreams, their hearts begin to beat, okay? They get erotically aroused in daydreams. they get angry, they get flushed. You know, the body's in there. It's not a detached, disembodied thing. And we can, there's a fancy Proust quote that I thought I'd pull up for you. And he speaks of this as a beautiful quote: "An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, something isolated, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. And at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory, this new sensation having the effect which love has of filling me with a precious essence. Or rather, this essence was not me, it was me." Okay, it was me. This is what Proust is getting at in Remembrance of Things Past. So I just want to conclude on this, which is that I want to ask everyone to try to imagine a time when you were betrayed. Someone betrayed you and you were screwed over. Not when you were a child, forget, not childhood. Keep childhood out of this, that's a different thing. But as an adult, someone betrayed you and you were devastated and you're outraged by their betrayal. Now, honestly ask yourself, honestly, while that you were in the relation with that person, did you do your due diligence to pay attention to all the warning signs? Did you? Did you see what was happening all along? Didn't you notice those little things that you chose to ignore? And if you really look at these moments of betrayal, you knew all along. You were opening yourself, you were making yourself vulnerable. This is really, again, people are going to argue with me about this, but I think a lot of people are going to get my point. How about when you fall out of love? How many times you say, oh my God, I knew all along this is the wrong thing. People know when they're on the marriage walk, when they're getting married, this is a mistake, but they do it. You have all heard these stories. They do it anyway. They know this is a mistake. They know this can't work, but they do it. They won't admit. And later on, when they fall out of love, okay, they realize, I knew all along. How many times in your life have you realized you knew all along? And this is a really interesting thing. This is, I think, the issue about lucidity. There's this aspect of us, and this is, I think, this speaks to Merleau-Ponty's Tacit cogito, which is there's an awareness we have all along, but we can't access. And I'm not going to be harsh and judging and say we all should be aware and responsible like this. No way. That's very hard to do. But I wonder sometimes if meditation is not an attempt to be able to access this lucidity and try to live it out in our lives a little better. I'll end at this point. Leave it open. Questions?
Okay, questions? Mahon?
That was really rich. I really enjoyed it, Jim. And this isn't a question so much as just to see what your take on something early on that you alluded to might be, and this notion of the alleviation of suffering that
Yeah.
we're hearing about.
Yeah.
And certain thinkers, so the Stoics, for example, I presume you can get caricatured in that way. Well, you can simplify your desires to such a point that it's almost impossible to be unhappy. Well, then you're happy. So it's kind of like that.
So you modify your desires.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
Ask less of life.
Right.
Mm.
So, number one, I want to see what you thought about that, and then just building on it a little bit. Should we be so quick to think that a major aspiration should be the alleviation of suffering, when in fact, actually learning to deal with suffering in a different way is probably something that's much more attainable. It could involve a recalibration of what we mean by suffering. And obviously, if someone is sawing your leg off,
It's going to hurt.
You say, well, I'd like that to stop, as opposed to, well, I wonder if I've experienced that differently.
Mahan, I just couldn't agree with you more. I don't think the purpose of life is to alleviate suffering. I agree with the Stoics in that. I think that, I like the Stoic idea of courage and fortitude. I think those are important virtues that the modern world just does not appreciate. I also think that there is knowledge and wisdom that comes with suffering. The problem is that too often, the neurotic suffers with no wisdom. So no, I don't think that mindfulness is about alleviate. And I think that is a real problem with a lot of this happiness psychology going around. I don't think the purpose of life is to be happy in that way. I'm more with Aristotle, where happiness only happens through good relationships that bring out your virtue. That people who call you on your shit, people who love you, care about you enough to critique you, to make you better. So I don't believe in this. I'm not a very good member of my psychology community. I don't see the healing that most people see as healing. I don't get that. I'm not on that program. I'm more of an existentialist in that sense. So by lucidity here, I'm simply saying, if we could be more lucid in our lives, it's not to get rid of suffering, it's to avoid unnecessary suffering, and therefore live life with more wisdom and more virtue and better quality friendships. I think the problem with psychopathology is just we don't know how to have good friendships. It's a really core issue. So, do I respond fully? Yeah. Anyone else? Please. This makes sense. This makes sense.
Speak up though, because they can't hear.
Oh.
All right. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
I'm very glad I staged.
Yeah.
It was very nice. Now, I was thinking what you were saying, that there are at least two ways to meditate. One, to leave daydreaming aside, to exclude it, and try to be in the moment, and a different one where you take all in. And I remember a few months ago, I was talking with a Buddhist nun, and she was saying something similar, that kind of the traditional meditation practice, kind of the hardcore Chinese way, well, she's a Zen Buddhist, is just to kind of stay in the moment, to kind of to be present, to not allow any thought really. Whereas kind of now they're more with kind of more modern way to do it, where you allow everything. So very much what you were saying. Now, on the other hand, I was thinking, because the topic is daydreaming, I was thinking that in so many different recorded meditation, guided meditations, for instance, it says there is this instruction that when your mind starts daydreaming, it's okay, but just get rid of it and return to the present moment,
right?
Rather than embrace the fantasy.
It's right. You acknowledge the fantasy. You don't force it away, but you gently turn back to your breath. So you don't go with the daydream.
That's right. But you're saying the opposite. Actually.
I am opening the question.
Yeah.
I'm opening the question, and I'm opening the question. Is there wisdom in watching your daydream unfold without getting engulfed in it? And do we call it meditation if you're watching your daydream but not getting engulfed in it? So can you observe the daydream but not be of it? That's the position that I'm talking about, this lucidity. And are there lessons to be learned from watching that movie reel, that karmic movie reel spin out? Is there karma to be burned, so to speak, to use New Age language? Okay. I think that there is. I think that there's actually therapeutic healing power in watching and learning our fantasies, paying attention to them as we do our dreams, our night dreams. But to be awake lucidly and to watch our daydreams go without being sucked in, but to be able to stand back and watch them. There's great things to learn about oneself. And I must tell you, the Tibetans are masters with this stuff. The Tibetans are the ones that really have perfected the dream yoga. They call it yoga nidra. They have dream yoga techniques where you actually go into these states, these in-between states, and you watch the passion play out, and you learn from it. So, and these are also tantric techniques where imagination is seen as your friend, and your passions are seen to be let loose. In tantrism, the idea is not to control your passions, but to let them loose and learn from them and let them play out, and not to be a victim of your passions, but to let them play out so that you can move on. Again, there's a lot to get from the tantric practices that we're not paying attention to.
Hayden?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. This was great. I've got just a couple of remarks. One, thinking about the distinction you laid out early, thinking about different ways that mindfulness tends to be taught, the kind of one-pointed,
Yeah.
more kind of field awareness. I'm thinking, like, as you know, in the kind of 8-limb vision of classical yoga, you move to the higher limbs through a sense withdrawal, and then you get dharana, where dharana is kind of sounding a lot like the single pointed focus.
Yes, it is.
And then you move into dhyana, which
Yeah.
is maybe more like the field awareness.
Yeah, a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, but thinking about how these relate together, as I've kind of been taught it in some techniques, really intense work in dharana is what eventually brings you into dhyana.
Yeah.
And so they're not really separate.
You could see the daydream as dharana, and you can see it as developing a relationship with the fantasy, but not getting absorbed. That's a relationship means you're not absorbed, you're separate, but you're in relationship in that ambiguous chiasmatic dynamic. And then, of course, samadhi is when it comes together. It's neither subject nor object, passive or active. Yeah, and that I think might be the position of owning your directing spectator position, as I'm calling it.
Anyway, just want to make that connection. And then maybe something that's, I'm not sure if it's critical yet, because I can't pull the text before my mind quite clearly right now, but in your discussion of the Tacit cogito, what you didn't mention is what Merleau-Ponty juxtaposes that with, which is I think it's the spoken cogito.
Yes. No.
And that's interesting because it's possible to overemphasize this, but later he gets a little bit concerned by the characterization he gave of that.
Yeah.
In the phenomenology of perception. And in some of the working notes for the visible and the invisible, he comes back to that and tries to rework it.
Oh, you're a great scholar. You're absolutely right. And he does. He renounces. He doubts the Tacit cogito. I don't. And that his renunciation. It's not quite a renunciation. He says he got it wrong in the relation between the silent and the spoken cogito. And I couldn't get into all that in this presentation. And I'm kind of leaving that issue aside. I'm just trying to mine the Tacit cogito for what works for me here in understanding this phenomenon. But it is a silent cogito. It's not a spoken, because it's more subtle than the spoken cogito. And it's true. He gets, and the literature is rife with people saying he denounced the Tacit cogito, but I'm like, there's something to salvage in it. I'm not sure he fully denounced it. He just wanted to reword it, reconfigure it. I don't think it was entirely rejection.
No, yeah.
But I am aware of that passage in Visible and Invisible.
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to your way of taking it as well. But I do wonder what was the thing he wanted to rework. And I do think he sees the relationship between the two as being a little bit more intimate than the initial presentation in phenomenology of perception.
Yeah.
I don't know if that is relevant or useful for what you want.
No, I'm grateful to bring that up, and I'm gonna go home and look into that a little more. Definitely want. If I'm gonna be, writing about the Tacit cogito, better be up on that better. Yeah. But by the way, I think when philosophers make mistakes, it's still productive. It doesn't mean you have to reject them. You can use them for other things. I don't think you have to just say, oh, well, you rejected this, so it's gone. There's things about Sartre that people belittle, but I think are great psychologically, not very good philosophically, maybe. Dermot.
Thank you, Jim. There's lots I'd like to comment on. I'd like to comment on the intercultural discussion earlier, but I just cut straight to the directing consciousness,
directing spectator.
Directing spectator. I mean,
I'm open to another name, by the way. I'm not married to that.
I think we have many of these. I mean, just as you said, there are many layerings of doing it and many ways. I mean, Husserl talks about Ich-Spaltung, the ego splitting. When we do it at all times, and this is one of the things I think Dreyfus gets completely wrong in talking about mindless coping, as he calls it. That there's always degrees of mindfulness involved in every activity. I give you an example I was just thinking about recently. I was watching someone do simultaneous translation. So you're listening in your ear through one language and coming out your mouth to another language.
It's a miracle to behold.
Whose manner it is, who's checking that this is going on? There's what you call the sensor, in daydreaming.
Yeah.
There's a kind of higher awareness. I'm not sure if it's more global, but it has to be in a way.
This is exactly what I'm talking about.
Wordless also. It's probably not a linguistic. It's not, what language is the translator working in when they're going between two languages?
There's certain crafts that people do. It's miraculous. Who's doing this? How many times have we all woken up from a dream like, who did that dream? It's just so, who did that? Wow. Who made that happen? It's miraculous sometimes. And we wake up sometimes and we're exhausted from the night's dreaming that we do. We're literally tired from all the lives and universes we've lived through. And who did that? Or when you're writing, so the writers talk about this, something takes over. And you're doing automatic writing. Something's coming through you. You're channeling. And who's doing that? People talk about this all the time. And it's something to talk about. I think there's more possibilities for us here. And I think we should be educated to do this. I think our children, instead of being belittled and castigated and punished for going into these trance states, I think we should teach them how to do it as our indigenous ancestors did. All indigenous peoples teach their kids how to fantasize, how to dream, how to encounter the spirits, how to deal with their emotions, how to manifest reality, how to deal with the monsters and the boogeyman and the devils. They teach them how to do this. We don't. And so we're left on our own psychologically. But we're not educated. We're taught so much bullshit in school. I mean, most of it is bullshit. But we don't teach the important things, which is how to live and how to cope with being a human being. It's never taught. And we know that the church has not always done a great job with that. They've done problematic job with it. And then churches have completely failed us in teaching their contemplative traditions. Beautiful, wonderful Christian tradition. No one ever taught me that, church. I had to find that out myself. So, I think education, therapy, and just everyday relationships can be so improved by somehow learning to navigate this possibility for lucidity.
Okay, we have 5 more questions. It's Yin Chen, then it's me, and then 3 people online. So.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the talk. I very appreciate. And my question is a little relevant to the ego splitting in the fantasy.
Yeah, ego splitting.
So Buddha say in fantasy is very special because I have the I, and I can in the fantasy there is another I. And I want to ask you, so how do you think there are many different selves, or is the I who making fantasy and the I in the fantasy perception?
Yeah.
Are they the same person? And this is the first question. And the second, only I want to so I think fantasy is so Buddha also say fantasy is like a perception. So I really appreciate what you say that
it is.
Fantasy is a kind of passivity.
Yeah.
Because I am in a fantasy, I am like in a quasi perception. So I am very immersed in what I make. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I after I did this research, I really got into Husserl, and he's just so rich, the descriptive language that he has for imagination and this kind of Splattung phenomena. I don't know if it's splitting, really. I don't know if Splattung translates as splitting, but Freud uses the term Splattung too. Because there's always still a totality. There's always still a global cognizance that is holding them together. And I don't like the tendency, I'm very wary of homunculization, little people within people kind of things, like what happens with Freud's language, ids and egos and all this. Although Freud didn't really do that. I do think that there's one focus, which is where the emotion is. The emotion is where you are inhabiting. And I think there's a desiccated or leftover automatic person left behind, driving the car or being bored in the lecture. The directing spectrum, I wouldn't want to name that as an ecological position. I'd more want to talk about it as a nodal point within a system of relations. So I'd want to understand these as nodal points, with loops like pretzels. interwoven, interlocked. And I like Merleau-Ponty's language of interwovenness, threads, so that they're separate but not, but together at once. And I believe that that's not contradictory. It's just the ambiguous truth of reality. It's tricky business talk about different selves. They're not. They are and they aren't. And this is where Merleau-Ponty's thinking is very helpful for us here. Do I respond fully to?
Yeah, thank you.
Husserl is just so amazing for this. But I read Husserl and Merleau-Ponty together as a tag team. I got into Husserl because he helped illuminate Merleau-Ponty. And I read Merleau-Ponty because he says what Husserl said better. He just says it better. He puts it together, makes sense out of Husserl. So I read Husserl through Merleau-Ponty and vice versa. And I use Husserl as a backup reference for understanding what Merleau-Ponty is talking about, what his sources are. So I read them together.
So I have a question.
Yes.
I want to describe an experience which the structure of which I'm not sure how you can make sense, how you make sense of it, and whether it undermines this synchronic structure that you've laid out of the daydreaming subject, whereby you have a habitual subject and then the daydreaming subject. Okay. And you can't mix the two together. And I got this is that if the moment you mix the two together, you lose the dream quality. But and this is very personal and existential that I'm going to describe.
Psychology is always personal.
Yeah. I sometimes experience being somehow mindful or present in the moment, whereby without any bifurcation of my consciousness, I'm here present, feeling quite happy, and it suddenly and it is a certain visceral lucidity comes to me, just like with daydreaming, and it's a very existentially heavy, and it is somehow revealing of the whole, let's say, where I at the same time feel that this what's happening now has the quality of a dream, and it has to do with temporality, that there's no way to grasp or fix what's going on. All of this will end at some point, and it will have been as if it was just a dream. Because what's next is the nothingness for us, and maybe there's a new generation that might try to imagine what went on in the past, which is what's happening now. So how would you make sense? What sort of structure is this? How would you make sense of the dream quality, whereby you don't have an alternative?
Right. You're feeling it now, in the waking present moment.
Yes, which has a dreamlike quality.
Well, it's not an accident that Merleau-Ponty begins the visible and invisible on the issue of the feeling of unreality that we experience when we wake up from our dreams. There's that moment where we can't believe that we gave the accent of reality to the dream when we're here again. And every now and then we are awake and we're not dreaming, but we have this feeling of lucidity in the present moment. It doesn't happen all the time. I mean, I do think more work needs to be done on thinking about what dreams are about. I think your philosophy of dreaming is your philosophy of life. I think there's a lot to it. It's amazing to me that philosophers don't spend more time on this as Merleau-Ponty did. And no one even pays attention to how he starts. He launches the visible and invisible on the issue of what happens, the accent of reality, the perceptual faith I had in the dream that I now don't have. And, it's amazing to me. You're talking about that feeling of presence in the present moment that does come sometimes. It's pretty rare. But there are moments when we are just fully present. And, I don't know that you can ever occupy the present moment fully. I think Husserl teaches us that's kind of an impossibility. But it's there. It's not accessible. Certainly there is only the present moment. And I think that, culture and all human existence is living outside the present moment, this whole thing we have. But I think every now and then the truth of the present moment emerges. And we have that. And I don't And it when it does emerge, it feels so unreal that we think it's like a dream. You know, because it's so rare.
So Susie had a
I'm rambling a
question
bit.
earlier.
Sorry.
Yeah, we have about we have 15 minutes left.
Whoa.
So Susie earlier said she was referring to the point of the talk in which you compare daydreaming to meditation, and she says that's a very interesting point. I wonder if its opposite is true too. I mean, if daydreaming is a form of meditation, are loop thoughts in which one projects the worst of any situation a form of mismanaged meditation as well? Of course, it doesn't seem so, but where's the line that distinguishes the quality of the two?
Okay, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that correctly because it's so packed. I'm going to lock on to mismanaged, and there are negative daydreams. There are daydreams that are not pleasant. There are neurotic daydreams that are repetitive and unpleasant, and you could call them bad trips. And those are the ones where you learn the most if you can get lucidity. The negative daydreams are the most important ones. Just like with negative psychedelic experience, they're the most important ones because that's where you learn, because that's where your unconscious is emerging and saying something that needs to be said that you're not listening to. So the problem is we don't train people to manage these difficult daydreams. No one's trained in this. You know, maybe sometimes if you get meditation training, you can handle these things better. And I think meditation training makes us better daydreamers and vice versa. I think that, does that answer you, Susie, in some way? I'm kind of exploring here.
Well, we can move to Minghon Chu says, thanks for the inspiring lecture. I would like to raise a question, half empirical, half philosophical, closely related to the one above. Part of my own research focuses on dreaming. Quite a handful of phenomenologists insist that we can perceive in the dream world as if in the real life, which means, of course, we can pay attention to dream objects. I wonder if daydreaming shares similar structure as well. Precisely, I wonder if daydreaming can coexist or not. Can we pay attention to objects with daydream, or does daydreaming and attention exclude each other? Thank you.
I would defer to the artists on this, because artists are particularly, they are imaginary aficionados, and they can use their dreams and inhabit their dreams in a way that really works for them. When I speak to creative writers and painters, they know how to access this in a fulsome way where the rest of us don't. So I just don't think we've even begun. There's some work. There's Robert de Soyer, who does guided reverie training from the 40s and 50s. There are people working in hypnosis who are working with this. It's big in Europe, especially in France, use of hypnosis. There's also a lot going on with psychedelics. I'm not afraid to talk about it. There's a big, wonderful upsurge, renaissance in the use of psychedelics. And there's some consonance here. People that meditate can use psychedelics very effectively and teach it. There's lots of ways to go with this kind of phenomenon. We're talking about creativity, but we're also talking about becoming wholesome and whole and healing at the same time. I think all these imaginary phenomena are cognate, interrelated, and but I think daydreaming is the most accessible of all of them. We can daydream while we're awake. We don't have to take drugs when we daydream, and we don't have to be asleep when we're daydreaming. So I think that's the place to start. So I don't know if I answered your question. I hope it helps.
So next question is Petri. Thank you, Jim. In the beginning, you said that in meditation, it is often said that when we fall into state of daydreaming and we should move to focus on breath. And you criticize this, and I agree with you. What about if it is not a choice between focusing on breath or daydreaming, but maybe true meditation is watching your mind or daydreaming within the atmosphere of breathing? In this kind of idea, daydreaming is figure and breath is the figure. I mean, breath is horizon, not figure. That was So daydreaming equals figure breath.
I haven't thought about breath and daydream. I know that if I'm thinking about my breathing, I'm not daydreaming. Yeah. On the other hand, I have practiced pranayama where very strange fantasies have emerged. Again, I'm getting personal here, but I think that there are different mental effects of different pranayama practices. If you pay attention to your imagination while you're doing pranayama, you're going to find some very interesting things. Of course, the most interesting one is when you do extended exhales. That's when your body reacts with anxiety, like it's going to die. And all kinds of fantasies can emerge there. So those are ways in which you can use breath to provoke certain reactions, and they usually manifest as fantasies. And I think that there's lots of room there for people, for breath scientists to work on. So that's just the best I can give you.
So, Lisa Foran, she says, thank you for this wonderful talk. I would love to know how you would suggest educating kids to navigate this lucidity.
Well, I got a lot to say. Do we have another hour? I raised a child, a daughter, and I made specific, really worked hard to engage in imaginary reality with her. And I taught her what my grandparents taught me. I taught her to live in an imaginary world, and with fairies and all that business. And I think it deeply affected her. I hope she's never going to see this. But I think that there are so many techniques for teaching kids to actively imagine. Kids naturally do it. You don't need to do anything with kids. Leave them alone, give them a context, guide them, coach them, stay out of the way, and they will naturally engage in fantasy. The main point is to leave them alone. And I think the Waldorf education technique is onto something. The Waldorf people say, don't impose rational linear thinking too soon. Let them have a period until they're 9. Let them have a period where they live out their emotional, affective, imaginary expressiveness. Then you teach them reading and writing, and they'll pick it up quick. But let them first develop their emotional, imaginary skills, but through play and imagination. So that's my answer to you. I think the Waldorf people are pretty good on this. And of course, they're not practicing it anymore because there's so much pressure to get kids to read and write quicker. But I do think literacy does block kids off from this important developmental stage. I do think we need to back off, leave them alone. Of course, the modern world is against this. No one's going to be able to pull this off. You could go to jail if you take your kid out of school. It's heavy pressure, but I really do believe that we should hold off on these skills until later. Let them first develop the important things, the human abilities. Let them build tree forts and make rockets and make house, whatever it is, and also have their imaginary fantasies. And as parents, we should encourage imaginary worlds and imaginary friends and imaginary dialogue. We should encourage that instead of being terrified by it.
Odysseus says, thanks for the interesting talk, James. Not a question, but I can really recommend Hannah Jacobs' excellent paper, I Am Awake, for a great Husserlian discussion of attention, including a discussion of daydreaming. Perhaps you know it.
I don't, and I can't wait to read it. I thank you so much, Odysseus. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's called Hannah Jacobs. What's it called?
I Am Awake.
I Am Awake. I'll get to it tonight. Thank you, Odysseus.
And Petri says maybe also Bachelard's work is also here helpful, as his whole phenomenology is phenomenology of daydreaming or of reverie.
Oh yeah, Bachelard's my good buddy. He's my nighttime reading. Yeah, Bachelard's incredible. And again, underappreciated. He not appreciated enough. Beautiful writing. And to read Bachelard is to go into poetic trance. That's what he wants. It's a remarkable guy.
Okay, so I think we have to stop here. Let's all thank Jim for the wonderful talk.
Thank you. I hope I sang for my meal. All right.
So that's the end of the day, and we will be resuming tomorrow morning as per program.